Hello aviators, Sky here, and today a completely enormous machine awaits us, both in terms of its role in the history of aviation and literally enormous. One of the heaviest transports in the world, one of the fathers of the concept of a wide-body plane, the world's largest turboprop aircraft, and just a flying cathedral. Let's get acquainted with the epic giant and its no less epic history, the Antonov An-22. The 1950s and 60s in the history of aviation were a time of great change, the main drivers of which were turboprop and jet engines, much more powerful than the old pistons and giving the aviators new opportunities to realize their fantasies. First, an industry revolution swept through the military, spawning a new generation of fighters and bombers. Then, civil aviation followed. A series of first-generation jet airliners turned the entire industry upside down in a decade. The military transport aviation was catching up, but remained relevant. Here in the 1950s, the score was ruled by a turboprop engine, which surpassed the jet engine in reliability and efficiency and gave a number of bonuses very useful for transports. It was then that some of the most famous and still flying medium machines were born, the American C-130 and the Soviet An-12. The Americans initially invested more actively in the development of heavy transports. Geography demanded that. Their first new giant in 1956 was the C-133 Cargo Master Heavy Turboprop. The plane turned out to be, let's say, controversial, but its appearance and operation made it obvious. The level of technological development, both propulsion and aviation in general, already made it possible to create large and heavy lifting aircraft, much more large and heavy lifting than before. In the USSR, air cargo transportation was not pursued so eagerly. Most of the destinations for their cargo were available by land. However, times were changing. On the one hand, Allies' political interests and bases were now scattered around the world. On the other hand, the realization of the potential of new technologies did not leave anyone indifferent. The military wanted an aircraft capable of carrying heavy and oversized load, be it a large number of soldiers, equipment, tanks, and even ballistic missiles, a very fashionable topic at that time. Well, aviators are aviators. Creating a huge, heavy breakthrough aircraft with outstanding specifications may be an incredibly difficult task, but no less incredibly interesting. The topic of heavy transport was studied at the Tupolev Design Bureau with their Tu-115 project, Beriev Design Bureau with the Be-16 project, and Ilyushin Design Bureau with the Il-60. Aviators from the Antonov Design Bureau, who got down to business most actively, were already working on a project for a heavy transport capable of lifting up to 40 tons, or nearly 90,000 pounds. And, seeing the potential, they in fact restarted it, significantly increasing the required capabilities. The Model 100, or VT-22, was as a result greenlit for implementation. Then, the engineers began the stage of solving problems, a huge number of problems, from determining the dimensions of the cargo compartment and next the entire layout, to choosing the optimal materials and structures. No one has ever created such a large aircraft with such a wide fuselage. And this is not counting the fact that we are not just talking about a wide-body aircraft, but about an aircraft that was supposed to be able to carry out airborne operations, dropping cargo weighing up to 20 tons, with the corresponding densities of loads on the structure and balance right in flight. Here we can add that the transportation of heavy and oversized cargo at that time was considered a priority task, and it was taken up widely. So, in parallel with the Antonov program, the MIL Design Bureau was implementing a similar project of the V-12 super lifting helicopter. However, unlike the An-22, which with all its risks hit the right spot, the giant helicopter turned out to be an overkill, so the Mi-12 never made it to the series production. The work on the project was carried out at a very fast pace. In 1961, the appearance of the aircraft was determined, and the guys from Antonov assembled its full-size mock-up, which was demonstrated to the military. The cargo compartment and the aircraft itself for that time seemed titanically huge. Almost any type of basic military equipment could easily fit inside, and when soldiers were loaded into it, the cabin accommodated 290 people. But this was a mock-up. Seeing all this, some of the guests doubted that such an aircraft would take off with a full load. But it had to take off. By 1963, assembly of the first prototype began. The main work was carried out at Antonov's pilot production plant in Kiev, and components were supplied from all over the Soviet Union, primarily from the aircraft plant in Tashkent. Finally, in August 1964, the first plane was transferred for flight tests. At the same time, the aircraft received the official name, An-22 Antei. The name Antei sounds epic and pompously, although given its origin in mythology, it raises questions. In any case, unlike the ancient Greek history, in the real world, Hercules did not have to fight Antheus, I guess. Ground and high-speed taxi tests revealed quite a few minor problems on the aircraft, which the engineers dealt with on the spot. This continued until February 1965, when the An-22 took off for the first time, officially becoming the largest aircraft in the world at that time. First tests were carried out quite dynamically, interrupting from time to time for demonstrations to the general public. The An-22 was first shown at the Paris Air Show in 1965, and in 1967, already at home during the air parade at Domodedovo. The transport flew to air shows regularly, and it killed two birds with one stone. It flaunted at the show and, in parallel, was used to transport the Soviet exhibition equipment. All this time, the giants continued to amaze everyone who dealt with them. The machines with a maximum takeoff weight of about 225 tons seemed to be real flying buildings, and the aviators, as part of the trials, carried out tests for the limits of their capabilities. The most striking, of course, were lifting 88 and then 100 tons of cargo, records for the military transport aviation of that time. The previous holder was the C-133 Cargo Master, 53 tons in 1958. This record was soon broken by the C-5 Galaxy, but before its appearance, the numbers were quite impressive. Speaking of records, despite the advances in carrying capacity, the idea of dropping 20-ton pieces of cargo turned out to be quite extreme. The An-22 could work with very high loads, and such operations were sometimes performed, but the main ones nevertheless were the parachute platforms with a carrying capacity of 10 tons. More modest of course, but working with them is much easier. A small disclaimer. At that time, in the United States, the C-141 was created, and many prefer to compare it with the Antei, and not the C-133, which had been flying for quite some time. However, the Starlifter was nevertheless a slightly different aircraft, with a slightly different goal setting, rather close to the Il-76, so it would not be entirely correct to put them head-to-head. As they say, turboprop to turboprop, jet to jet. While the aviators were measuring size and mass, the issue of serious production was being decided. The large role of the Chkalov aviation plant in Tashkent in the manufacturing of aircraft parts eventually became the main one. The plant had good potential, and the guys from Antonov had already worked with them, producing the An-12. The line was seriously modernized and received the necessary production areas and equipment for an aircraft of this size. In 1966, the first plane that was made there took off. The serial production had been quite intensive for several years, with a peak of 11 planes per year. During the production process, the aircraft were constantly being improved from series to series, so the earliest planes are in fact quite different from the later ones. By 1976, the production of the An-22 was completed. A total of 69 aircraft were assembled, 3 prototypes were born in Kiev, and 66 serial aircraft respectively in Tashkent. It's quite surprising. When you get acquainted with the history and the adventures, it seems that there should have been a lot more planes. So, let's take a closer look at the plane. The An-22 is a classic military transport aircraft of its time, with a high wing, 4 turboprop engines, a 2-fin tail unit, and gigantic dimensions. Well, okay, not quite classic. The most important part of the aircraft, and the center of the entire project, is the cargo compartment. It received dimensions of 4.4 by 4.4 meters in cross-section and 26.4 meters in length along the floor, just so that the stages of the new promising at that time missiles would fit in, such as the UR-500, the future Proton. The main challenge for the aviators in such a huge cabin was the appropriate dimensions of the entire fuselage, the length of which reached 57 meters, and the diameter 6 meters. The recently created An-12 looked like a tiny bird next to it. It was necessary to keep a balance, to ensure sufficient strength and reliability of the structure while keeping its weight within reasonable limits. The risks were very high. Antonov himself mentioned that it was even difficult to overcome the psychological barrier associated with the fear of a very fat fuselage. Nowadays you won't surprise anyone with wide-body airliners, but at that time many believed that such chubby cigars would simply fall apart in flight. The fight was epic. When creating the An-22, the most advanced, durable and light alloys were used. The designs were calculated as carefully as possible, and many elements were created not as prefabricated structures, but as large monolithic parts, which complicated production but reduced weight. The fuselage is divided into several main parts. The nose section has two decks. On the lower deck there is a navigator's cabin, a small sitting area, onboard equipment, and a niche for the front landing gear. On the upper deck is the main cockpit, and behind it a rest area, where escorts, passengers, and additional crew members could be accommodated, if the aircraft is on a long mission and the flight time needs to be increased. The room, by the way, is rather big, not like Ruslan's of course, but there's a decent amount of space. There were even TVs added there at one time. Antonov knows what a pilot wants. The middle section is the largest and includes first of all the cargo compartment with its huge spaces. By the way, the cabin is not empty at all. All over the place here there's a lot of equipment, without which the work with cargo would be greatly complicated. This is not a garage after all. The floor here, considering the loads, had to be as strong as possible, so it is made mainly of titanium. The space below it is also occupied by equipment, drives and pipelines with access through internal hatches. The service tunnel passing there is quite large and is known among aviators as the Antonov Prospect or the Antonov Street. It should be noted that the nose and middle compartments are sealed, both from the external environment and from each other. This gives flexibility in work and saves resources. For example, if the plane is carrying paratroopers, the air conditioning system maintains pressure in both the cockpit and the cargo compartment. But if in the belly of the beast there was only some kind of equipment that did not need to breathe, the cargo compartment could be left without pressurization. The tail section of the fuselage had a rather complex shape. To simplify loading and unloading operations with the creation of a direct path into the aircraft, the tail is lifted. Meanwhile, the fairing, integrated with the stabilizer, is horizontal and slightly flattened. The result of this design dance was the Antonov's distinctive beaver tail. The entrance to the cargo compartment is made up of a large lowering ramp, as well as a flap that, on the contrary, is rising up. The opening way turns out to be quite large, and some vehicles can go inside by themselves, provided that the drivers are careful. On the sides of the fuselage are two huge fairings, huge even for such a colossus as the An-22. The reason for this size is their filling. The fairings fully accommodate the main landing gear, some of the equipment, fuel tanks, and doors on both sides. The decision to make such large fairings is a compromise. On the one hand, it considerably simplifies the design, on the other, degrades the aerodynamic quality. But the turboprop's flight speed is not very high, and the disadvantage was considered not critical. On the Jet brothers, they had to come up with other solutions. Like other transport aircraft, the An-22 was supposed to have a low-sitting fuselage and the ability to work with runways of different quality, from slick concrete airfields to more or less decent soil. For this, it received a squat tricycle landing gear. The front support, of course, is rotating with a two-wheeled bogie. Everything is as expected. The main landing gear consists of two groups of bogies, with a pair of wheels in 3 rows, located just under the large fairings and hidden inside them in flight. The landing gear of the aircraft combines huge dimensions, the wheels here are as big as person's height, and a simple design. There are no sophisticated gear retraction mechanisms. Simplicity, however, was not a goal in itself. The Antonov engineers came up with many interesting tricks. For example, early versions could adjust wheel pressure based on conditions. Good runway, higher pressure. Bad one, off-road option. Also among the possibilities of the landing gear are retracting and releasing each strut separately. And while the pumping over time was removed from the planes, the wandering struts turned out to be very useful. Another feature of these bogies is that they are self-orienting and can rotate 5 degrees. This feature simplifies taxiing at the airport and also reduces the load during landing, for example in strong winds when the planes land slightly sideways. And at first glance, everything is simple, right? The wing of the aircraft is trapezoidal, with a total span of 64.4 meters. The wing looks as simple as possible and resembles a scaled wing of the An-12, but given the size and load, the aviators had to play with the design. Technically, it was made up of several huge connected consoles, providing strength and flexibility, while their size and quality delivered decent aerodynamics. Mechanization is very large, but minimalistic, represented by big double-sized flaps, as well as ailerons extended to the very tips. Slats and spoilers did not find their place here. Given the capabilities of the turboprop giant, they were not particularly needed. Empennage of the Antei has 2 fins with a large horizontal stabilizer. A similar solution is used on some transports, for example on the giant An-22, but in this case the motive is slightly different. The huge dimensions of the aircraft greatly increased the risks related to the resource, especially of the fuselage. The tail section was already weakened by the huge cargo hatch built into it, and the standard fin could further increase the torque load arising from the deflection of the rudder. Precisely to reduce this load, it was decided instead of one large fin to make 2 small ones and spread them to the sides of the horizontal stabilizer. Plus, to reduce vibrations and the risk of flutter, they were moved a bit forward. This is how the unusual tail of the An-22 appeared. Tail mechanization in this scheme is more complicated: elevators on both sides of the fuselage and rudders on each fin, separated by the horizontal stabilizer. By the way, the use of this tail has some nuances regarding the power plant, so let's move on to it. The power plant of the An-22 is represented by 4 NK-12 engines. The NK-12, with its 15,000 horsepower, is the world's most powerful turboprop engine. It rotates 2 large coaxial propellers at once. These engines were originally created for the Tu-95 strategic bombers, and over time found a place on all of its modifications, as well as on the Tu-114 airliner. But while the use of a turboprop on those machines still causes conceptual controversy, for the military transport An-22, the solution was practically ideal. Of course, it cannot be said that these aircraft have the same engines. The transport received a modification, the NK-12MA, which, in addition to a number of changes in the design, received a clear external difference: other propellers. On Tupolev's aircraft, the engines are equipped with propellers with a diameter of 5.6 meters, which were optimal, both when taking into account the height of their location, the wings of these aircraft were not very high, and for ensuring flight speeds of 700 to 800 km per hour, over 400 knots, a huge figure for turboprop aircraft. The An-22 presented different conditions. It was much heavier, which required more thrust, and a high flight speed, on the contrary, was not so important for it. At the same time, the height of the wing practically removed the dimensional restrictions. The conclusion was obvious. The engines of the aircraft were equipped with new propellers, with an increased diameter reaching 6.2 meters. There are many advantages of the turboprop on Antonov. Among them, we can immediately indicate the active airflow of the wing, which increases the lift. By the way, for all its gigantism, the wing of the An-22 is not that big, in comparison with the size of the aircraft itself. The second important factor is of course propellers with a controlled pitch up to negative. That is, they can turn and not pull the plane forward, but push it backwards, braking like a thrust reverser. Another factor, not so obvious but also interesting: the second and third engines, which are closer to the fuselage, blow not only on the wing but also on the tail unit, which makes it sensitive at different speeds, sometimes even too sensitive. All these bonuses of course had their price. The speed of the aircraft was reduced to 550 to 650 km per hour, or 350 knots, which in comparison with relatives in the NK-12 is not a lot, and even more so with jet engines. But this exchange has justified itself 100-fold. The An-22 is considered one of the most economical and flexible aircraft, even taking into account the fact that many seemingly much more technologically advanced machines had appeared over the next decades. Considering the requirements for this very flexibility and operating conditions, the Giant of course received an auxiliary power unit, or more precisely, units. The APUs are located in the front part of the right fairing of the landing gear, and while in the early series it was one gas turbine TA4, in the later series they began to install two TA6 units at once. Duplicating each other, they significantly increased the reliability of the system and the time of work on the ground. Sometimes, loading and unloading are very lengthy processes. The An-22 crew can vary considerably depending on the tasks assigned and on what the plane is carrying. The obligatory set for aircraft of this size is quite familiar. In the main cockpit sit the pilot in command, assistant commander, flight engineer, aviation equipment technician, and the radio operator. The onboard equipment is of course vintage. In comparison with the cockpits of modern aircraft, it looks frighteningly complex. But it is interesting to study, a relic of the epic past. Besides, they spared no expense on manufacturing. Each transport carries several dozen kilograms of valuable metals, including gold and silver. The glazing is quite wide, and given the very structure of the cockpit, curved like a canopy of a fighter, it gives quite a decent view. In addition, from the outside, the cockpit looks unusual and gives the aircraft a special look. The An-22 cannot be confused with anything. On the lower deck, in his own small cockpit, there is a navigator who also enjoys the views. Enjoys though, not like the navigators of some other aircraft. Here the view is slightly cut off by the locators of the Kupol navigation and targeting system placed under the fairings in the nose. It can also be identified externally by the presence of a radar fairing in the lower part of the nose. Similar tools have become traditional for heavy transports. On the first series of Antei, by the way, the flight navigation complex was simpler, without additional locators, so in their nose they had neat, round glazing. A special task for the aviators was the control of such a colossus. At that time, there were no fly-by-wire systems, and the guys from Antonov needed to ensure a sufficiently effective control of all elements, located due to the size of the aircraft quite far from the cockpit and from each other. The plane received a complex network of cable and traction drives with boosters, and in case of failure, a purely manual one was also provided. Piloting the plane like that would be quite a bodybuilding competition, but considering the conditions, the engineers did a very good job. The process of testing and acceptance of the An-22 into service was rather long and complicated, so they were commissioned only in 1969. Nevertheless, all this time the planes were not just sitting around. They did not risk carrying crowds of paratroopers at the beginning, but the cargo was welcome. The An-22 could carry cargo weighing about 40 tons at a distance of more than 5,200 kilometers. The mass of 60 tons took 2,000 kilometers away from that distance. This was quite enough for almost any transportation within the USSR, which was what they were doing. The planes easily delivered heavy equipment and bulky cargo to hard-to-reach regions, the logistics of which were previously a hell of a mess. Given the complexity and novelty of the Giant, the military received the An-22 with a decent number of representatives of the aviation industry and test pilots who were supposed to help master the machines. Antei quickly went to the exercises. The crews had to master the aircraft, the paratroopers had to figure out how to work with them, and the commanders had to adopt new operational tactics, taking into account the new possibilities of transports with previously unprecedented characteristics. Big trump cards appeared in the sleeve. The first global mission of the An-22 was the transportation of humanitarian aid to Peru, which suffered from a strong earthquake in 1970. The planes performed very well, completing 60 flights, but not without misfortune. During the flight to Lima, one of the planes disappeared over the Atlantic Ocean. A search operation was organized and the debris was found in the water, but the cause of the disaster remained a mystery for a long time. Misfortune never comes alone. In the same year, another plane crashed while transporting cargo to India. Serious failure and attempted forced landing, unsuccessful. The problem of the aircraft was one of its main trump cards. New, large propellers with fiberglass shells were quite picky about the quality of production, and in the event of manufacturing violations, degraded and could collapse in flight, threatening to chop up half of the aircraft. This is what happened. A blade that broke off in flight hit the fuselage and tore the wiring of the control system, stopping all the engines at once. The problem was solved. The production was modernized and over time, to improve reliability, the cable network in the aircraft itself was redistributed. Since the early 1970s, the An-22 was already being widely used, both in the USSR and abroad. They carried humanitarian supplies, were one of the foundations of logistics with allies in the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and in general wherever needed. Size, transportation capabilities, and flexibility made them an excellent tool in the hands of the military transport aviation. Of course, the giants managed to work in Afghanistan as well. The An-22s were used to deliver large-sized vehicles and equipment that was difficult to deliver by other means. The work was dangerous. The aircraft received basic protection from surface-to-air missiles, primarily false heat targets, but the military preferred not to test their fate and tried to involve the giant only in extreme cases, using mainly its smaller brothers. One of the most interesting episodes of Antei's service was its participation in the creation of a great air, Ruslan. When in the 1980s the production of the An-124 began, many elements of its airframe were made in Tashkent. The problem was that the final assembly was not carried out there, and they had to find a way to deliver huge parts to Ulyanovsk and Kiev. The only viable solution was air travel. By the way, the An-22s had already taken part in such operations, transporting oversized parts of both the smaller Antonovs and, for example, the Tu-144 fuselage sections. But such huge parts could not fit into the cargo compartment, even of Antei. In the beginning, there were ideas of modifying the fuselage, enlarging it significantly, something like the modern Airbus Beluga and Boeing Dreamlifter aircraft. But on a high-wing plane, such a modification was not feasible. So, it was decided to organize the transportation by placing oversized cargo on the back, securing it above the fuselage. This practice is rare in aviation, but sometimes it cannot be done otherwise. The VMT transported parts of launch vehicles. The modified Boeing 747s were carrying the space shuttle. And then the An-225 lifted Buran. The An-22, with its design, was very useful here. Studies had shown that it did not require large-scale changes to adapt it for such tasks. Already in 1980, the modified Antei went to Tashkent, where it received the first cargo, the center wing box of its air. The aircraft in such special carrier modifications actively flew until 1994, delivering parts of the An-124 and An-225. It should be noted that the imagination of aviators was not limited to the external suspension of oversized cargo. During the entire period of development and production of the aircraft, quite a few modifications were proposed for them, from simple to very exotic. There were many projects to create heavier versions, various special options, search and rescue, carriers and air launch platforms for ballistic missiles, and so on. Among the most actively promoted was, for example, a military transport amphibian with ship outlines and floats. When implemented, it would have turned out to be a boat, slightly smaller than the Hughes's giant H-4 Hercules. There was also a passenger version with an elongated fuselage and 2 decks inside, capable of accommodating 724 people with all conveniences, a cinema room, lounges and restaurants, a kind of a giant brother of the already huge Tu-114. And of course, the 1960s dictated their own trends. It was the heyday of the atomic era, and people were sure that nuclear reactors would soon be put on everything, including airplanes. The problem of a nuclear reactor on board was the enormous mass of both itself and the protection for the crew. The An-22, being the heaviest transport, was the best suited for this task, and received a small-sized reactor connected to a modified power plant. When it was necessary to provide maximum thrust, for example during takeoff, the engines were powered by conventional fuel, and in cruising mode by the reactor. It was assumed that this would allow the aircraft to stay in the air for up to 50 hours, covering distances of about 27,500 kilometers, almost 15,000 miles. But none of these projects were implemented. The giant amphibian was a surplus, the already existing machines did its job. A super large turboprop passenger airliner, an idea with many questions. although it did break the record for the number of passengers in 1972, when it transported 700 people from Egypt in the cargo compartment. The comfort was not so hot, but the figure is impressive. Meanwhile, the atomic aircraft were created, like similar atomic versions of the Tu-95, but they were all flying labs. Over time, the idea of reactors on the An-22 was abandoned, just as the concept of atomic-powered aircraft was abandoned in principle. Maybe this is for the best. The Anteis were used very actively, both in the USSR and abroad, and the intensity of their operation remained high even after the introduction of the Il-76 and An-124. The demand for them was very high, and given that there were not so many planes, the aviators were not sitting idle. In the 1990s, Antei continued flying, performing both commercial cargo transportation and military operations to hotspots that arose not in distant foreign countries, but often already at home. This intensity has not been without disasters. 9 aircraft were lost. Considering that a total of 69 planes were built, this is of course a bit too much, although it can be noted that the early heavy military transports in terms of reliability and safety were not the greatest. Here, the disasters were at least stretched out over several decades of active operation. As practice has shown, the An-22 has occupied a rather successful niche among its jet relatives. It is quite beneficial in terms of fuel consumption, has a huge cargo compartment, and is not picky about airfields. The Il-76 in most characteristics surpasses the Antei, but is inferior in spaciousness. Ruslan, it seems, surpasses its ancestor in all respects, but in operation it turns out to be quite expensive, and with all the solutions it is more demanding to the runways. Even now, the aviators have tasks that in fact can only be performed by the An-22. For example, the transportation of fighter jets for maintenance from an airbase to a factory. In the Il-76, such cargo often doesn't fit, and the An-124 may not be able to land on a standard fighter airfield. Antei is really helpful here. The 1990s and 2000s were a blow to the giant, when at the beginning, due to lack of money, the planes were parked and did not fly. And then, when they could be returned to service, it was decided that the effort would be too complicated and expensive, so it will be easier to just write them off. For 2021, most of the aircraft of course no longer fly. The overwhelming majority of the park has been dismantled. Some of the planes have been transferred to museums. Several planes still fly in the fleets of the Russian military transport aviation and the Ukrainian Antonov Airlines. The An-22 can be called almost a museum exhibit. The plane has already aged both morally and physically, although again, in a number of tasks it is still very good. In any case, Antei can be considered a happy plane. It appeared when it was needed, did everything that was required of it, and now slowly is going to retire. It is unlikely that its creators thought that their brainchild would still be roaring in the sky of 2021. Such is the story of the turboprop giant. Comment what you think about this plane, like and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to watch the videos early, see some exclusive behind-the-scenes content, or just support the channel, consider joining our Patreon community. Fast flights on big planes and soft landings to you.